Hi, everyone. My name is Anne Koizumi, and I'm a learning program manager at the National Film Board of Canada. Welcome to a special presentation for Asian Heritage Month. Today, we'll be having a conversation with animators Thao Lam and Howie Shia. Before introducing our guests, I'd like to acknowledge that I am a guest in Tiohtià:ke, commonly known as Montreal, and that I'm a settler living and working on unceded Indigenous lands that is protected and cared for by the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. And I want to express my gratitude to be here. I'm really excited to be here today with these two extremely talented storytellers and animators, Howie Shia and Thao Lam. I'd like to introduce you to Howie Shia. Howie Shia is a Toronto-based illustrator, animator, writer, and director. His shorts have won several awards internationally, including the 2007 Grand Prix at the Tokyo Anime Fair. Much of his work combines a love of ancient mythologies and a fascination with modern urban environments, creating contemporary visuals using mostly traditional drawing techniques. Howie also draws heavily on music, especially contemporary jazz and hip hop. Along with his brothers, Howie is the co-founder of PPF, a Toronto Taipei music, animation, and design studio that creates both independent and commercial work for the likes of the National Film Board of Canada, Disney, Nike, UN Habitat, and others. His latest film, For North A, is a collaboration with filmmaker Jordan Canning. For North A is Howie's fifth animated short with the NFB, following BAM in 2015, Peggy Baker, 4 Phases in 2009, Flutter in 2006, and Ice Ages in 2004. Let's take a look at the trailer for the short animated film For North A, directed by Howie Shia and Jordan Canning. I'll now introduce Thao Lam. Thao Lam is a critically acclaimed Vietnamese-Canadian children's book author and illustrator. Her books include Thao, Wallpaper, My Cat Looks Like My Dad, Skunk on a String, and the multi-award-winning Paper Boat. Thao arrived in Canada with her parents at the age of 3 as a refugee from Vietnam. Learning English was difficult, and it was picture books that helped her understand this new world and ignited her passion for visual storytelling. She has an insatiable love for colored and textured papers, which she uses to create her exuberant collages. She recently directed the animated film Boat People with the NFB, which is currently traveling the film festival circuit. And now let's take a look at the trailer for the short animated documentary Boat People, directed by Thao Lam and Kajal Borsma.
Ants have lived on Earth for over 140 million years. Faced with annihilation, ants become protective, risking all to ensure the safety of the colony.
without further ado, let's start the conversation. I have so many questions for the both of you. And Thao and Howie, feel free to ask each other questions during this conversation. Also, audience members who are here with us virtually, we will have a question period at the end of the session to enrich the conversation using the Q&A function on Zoom. So I'm going to start with how you both got into animation, and I'll start with you, Thao. If you could tell us a little bit about your journey kind of getting into animation and how you became a filmmaker.
I actually started in children's books. Like, that's my background and my training in children's book illustration. And as for an animator, I have no training in animation. I sort of stumbled into it by accident and pure luck. But the thing I realized after making Boat People is that it's film and making books is similar in the storytelling process. And so that at least I understood. But like, filmmaking and animation is a totally brand new world to me. And there is still like so much that I need to learn. So I wouldn't call myself an animator. I think the best title would be a storyteller, because I think animators out there would just would just laugh if I did call myself an animator, because I feel like animators have so much more patience than I do. So I don't think I have the personality to be an animator.
Well, there's definitely different types of animators, and you can definitely call yourself one, considering you made this beautiful film. And I definitely have a question for you later in regards to, comparing your book illustration practice as well versus, this animation project. But no, that's super interesting. But when did you kind of know that the paper boat would become a film? Like, how did that kind of happen?
Well, I always pictured the paper boat or Boat People, the story of it, as a film. And because for me, the migration of refugees and just the idea of getting into a boat and escaping and then moving from like the refugee camp to Canada, or just the idea of the whole story of, or the analogy of ants, all of that is movement. And so when I was picturing this story in my head, it played out like a silent film. And I think most of the way I approach bookmaking is the same way. Like, this story always plays in my head like a silent film. So I never really pictured it as a book. I wanted it to be a film, and so it took a while for me to like find the right partnership, which is with the NFB. And it's been, quite a journey to learn how to make a film.
Well, I have to say, it's a beautiful adaptation and such an important story. And I think you've done an incredible job of taking that leap from making books to making films. So
yes, I had a lot of support. A lot of encouragement. It was like, that's the other thing I learned about filmmaking, is like, it's a very team sport, like very different from making books. And so I really had a team to help me through this.
100%. Oh no, 100%. It's definitely a collaborative effort. Let's go to Howie. Howie, you've been doing this for quite some time, but I'd love to hear more about your origin stories. How did you get into animation? How did you become a filmmaker? Tell me a little bit about this journey.
It's really not very interesting, unfortunately. It kind of happened by accident, from out of desperation. I had gone to art school. I also don't have any formal training in animation, so I had gone to through the art program at the U of T, and when I came to university, I started being very interested. I'd always liked animation, but I started seeing films in general that for the first time kind of seemed more tactile, I guess, in the way they're made, that in a way that I thought like, oh, I can see how that was made and how I could express myself in that way, I think. Specifically with like filmmakers, for whatever reason, mostly Chinese filmmakers or Taiwanese filmmakers, Ho Shia and Wong Kar-wai, the fifth generation directors. And I had been studying primarily drawing and printmaking and some video art. And so I'd always sort of done little bits of animation in the video art stuff. And then I saw a call for Hot House 2, I think it was, which is the NFB's incubator program for young up-and-coming animators, which is a fantastic program. And I just applied and was sort of fortunate enough to be accepted. And I did my first film with the NFB, I don't remember, 2004, 2005, something like that. It's a 30-second piece or so, very easy to sort of wrap your head around. Making a short film is actually very hard from a storytelling point of view, but from a technical point of view, it's you can sort of really learn how to make the technical side of how to make a film that way. And literally all the other people, I think, had experience animating. So it was a lot of people just sort of looking over my shoulder and saying, that's not how you do it, which I appreciated it. And then, yeah, and then from there, what I found, I think, was that not only did I kind of like the process, because I did feel like it was similar to printmaking insofar as you do a pass and then you refine and you refine, specifically in intaglio printmaking, I think, and you refine. And then, but also I found that the kind of stories being told specifically in short animation were closer to my tastes in literature and stuff like Borges and Marquez and Rushdie and the sort of the magic realists, and sort of presented in short form and sort of brief poetic sort of moments. And then I've just sort of continued through making films both through the NFB, and then I've been lucky enough to do freelance commercial work with some of the larger studios too. So yeah.
That's incredible. I didn't realize that you were self-taught and that you didn't actually go through an animation program. I think I just assumed through your work, and I've seen all of your films, that that you had gone through some animation program, some intense animation program. So,
oh no, I don't think I would get to a school now. Still, I don't.
What?
When I made my second film with the NFB, Flutter, the first thing I did when I got the green light was I went out and bought the Robert Williams book, because I realized, yeah, now.
That's great. That's great. No, I think books are a great way to learn, and I also learned how to do animation through a book produced by the Aardman Studios. So no, it's fantastic. Okay, I'm going to go back.
Say,
Yes,
before
yes.
we do anything, Anne herself is an exceptional director, and if anybody hasn't seen her latest film, In the Shadow of Pine, you should find it.
Oh, thank you, Howie. But don't try to turn the tables here. This is about you and Thao today. So no asking me questions. No, I'm going to turn it back to Thao because I want to talk a bit more about Boat People. I really wanted I want to hear about how you decided to tell this story, and why it was important for you to tell this story about your family's journey to Canada. And this is a multi-part question. And lastly, through your research, did you discover anything that you didn't know? Yeah, if you could tell us a bit more about Boat People.
Yeah, I didn't know much about the history of like the Vietnam War or about Boat People. What I saw was like on like television, like 60 Minutes and stuff when I was like a kid. But so I actually learned a lot, and I did a ton of research on it. I like to dive into subjects when I'm writing about it. It's my method of procrastinating. But I think the most fascinating thing I learned is interviewing my family, and the stories I got from my dad, especially because we didn't talk about it at home. I knew where we came from, and I knew how we came here, like the general idea that we got on a boat and like went across the waters. But it was really fascinating after, like, I think I started this film when I was 40. We'll say 40, we'll say it out loud. So that was the first time ever where I got like kind of the full scope of our travels, and like all the gossip and background story of my family. And I learned that my grandmother intentionally stayed. My dad's mom intentionally stayed, and she chose to stay in order to make sure that, like, if anybody got caught, that she would be there as like outside of the prison to facilitate anything. And my uncle's family actually got caught, and so she ended up raising 5 of his kids on her own. So it was really like a fascinating thing to learn the reasons why people choose to stay or people choose to leave. And I've asked my dad that question, actually, where I said, like, because now if you look back at, like, Vietnam right now feels very stable, and like there's a lot of people traveling to Vietnam for trips, and there's a lot of businesses. And I'm like, well, what happened if we stayed? Like, I asked my dad that, and he was just like, he would never go back. So he did not regret his decision. So now I lost track of
No.
I just went on a rant. But that was like the biggest thing I learned while making this film. And the reason I chose to make it was because I was going through a divorce at that time, and I was trying to figure out how families start over, and how I got from being this girl that, like traveled across the waters to this woman that ended up being divorced. So I was trying to connect the dots and see what decisions I made that got me to that point. And I think along the way, I read so many stories of families that were that made the decision to leave their country and their homes and their friends and family. And that kind of gave me strength and courage to rebuild, because that was what their story was rebuilding and surviving, right? And resilience. And so I think that was really helpful for me to like bury myself in this project, because it gave me a distraction, but it also gave me examples of people being like resilient.
It's really incredible to hear you talk about your own personal journey and how you found strength through your family's story. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And when you finished the film, and I know you finished the film recently, did you have a chance to show your family the film, and how did they respond?
This is going to be our secret. I actually haven't told my parents I made a film.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't know it's out there. Everybody else knows it's out there, but they don't. It's a weird dynamic between my parents and I don't know if it's an Asian thing or it's just my family, but this film is very precious to me in the idea that it's very personal, and my family tends to have a way of poo-pooing on my personal things, and so I kind of don't want to share it because I'm afraid they're gonna wreck it for me. I know I'm going to therapy for this, so but yeah, that's kind of how it is at the moment. I don't even tell them I write books, so it's a very weird dynamic between us, but that's where my family is at the moment. But my daughter has seen it. She's seen it multiple times.
And how does she like it?
I told her I was going to Montreal for the screening of it just recently, and she said, "Oh, Mama, so you're gonna go? People are gonna pay money to go see your commercial?" And I was like, no. She called it a commercial. I thought I don't know if that was an insult or a compliment, but that's where we're at.
I'm sure she's very proud of you. But I also understand that, families are complicated, and maybe it's an East Asian thing, but yeah, it is oftentimes very difficult to talk about your personal experiences, especially personal experiences that have been challenging or difficult, and to kind of bring them out into the open. I know that can be very difficult for East Asian families, and oftentimes the tendency is to hide a lot of those stories and to kind of bury those stories. So yeah, congratulations to you, Thao, for really for the courage to share this story with the world. And anybody who's watching the webinar, don't tell Thao's parents that she's made a film about them. Okay, I'm going to move on to Howie, because I want to talk a bit about a film that you made titled Marco's Oriental Noodles. This is a film that was actually produced by the CBC, and I'm interested in terms of how it came to be. Why was the story important to take place in a small town in Saskatchewan, and why was it important for you to tell this story?
The actual origin of the film is pretty banal. I was asked by Carolyn Hugh and Jesse Wente, who were both at the CBC at the time. They were doing a series of shorts called Keep Calm and Decolonize, which was a phrase that Buffy Sainte-Marie had used in a speech some time ago. They were just looking for sort of visions of what a decolonized Canada might look like. And I had originally actually turned them down because I wasn't sure that I was the right person to tell the story, because in fact, I'm kind of a beneficiary of colonization. My parents having immigrated in during the sort of policy, or maybe just before the policy of multiculturalism and all that. But they eventually, they told me to just sort of think it over, and at one point I came up with this notion that I didn't have to make a film about sort of the indigenous experience, but I could make a film about appropriation and the appropriation of culture. And to me, that I knew for whatever reason I wanted to talk about food because I felt like food was kind of the one thing that people who were sort of very militant about decolonization and equality and these kinds of issues kind of gave a pass to, right? Everybody is, with a college degree, is kind of looking for authentic ramen or authentic tacos or whatever. Like they have a right to it, as opposed to like, letting that culture and letting that food evolve into its own thing. They wanted something that sort of holds it in place. And so that's sort of where the idea for the film sort of spilled out of. The second part was why in small town Saskatchewan, is that right?
Yeah.
Again, it was, I'm from Saskatchewan, and I think having set the film in the future, it's a sort of a sci-fi piece. One of the things I was thinking about too was how I guess maybe to answer both part 2 and 3 of it was I'd started the film just sort of after Trump had won the election. And so many of my colleagues and friends, especially in the arts, were really, and so much of the media that we were taking in were so confused because they didn't know anybody who voted for Trump or had sort of more conservative leanings. And coming from Saskatchewan, I did, and there were like people in my family and my good friends of mine and their families, right? And they weren't terrible people. They just had different information and different priorities than us. And I kind of felt like if like people like me don't talk about this kind of community, then nobody will. And so and sort of the tension within those communities, I guess. And so I think the idea for me was, having said it in the future, sci-fi is generally about, with a few exceptions that I can think of, is generally about sort of mega cities and uber cities, and there's very little sort of acknowledgement that more rural, not even more rural, but just like smaller communities have an identity in the future. And that seemed like, in its own way, a sort of colonial tendency to sort of wash over the smaller communities. And so I said it there just to give those communities kind of the communities that I grew up in, basically, a place in, plant a flag in the future, like this place is reserved for the people I grew up around.
That's great. And you mentioned that you grew up in Saskatchewan, and it's really just nice to see, obviously, this film kind of taking place in smaller town Saskatchewan. And I couldn't help but think about a lot of the first wave Chinese immigrants and second wave Chinese immigrants coming in to create their own Chinese food restaurants, and how many Chinese food restaurants exist within these small communities. And I couldn't help but make that connection as well to your film, but then obviously taking place in the future, because a lot of those places are now disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just think it's such a beautiful film. And again, you can watch Howie's films on YouTube, but also on nfb.ca. I'm going to move into more of a conversation, both with Howie and Thao. And, feel free to answer these questions, like a dialogue, like an exchange. We're seeing a lot more Asian representation on the screen in Canada with films such as Minari, the TV series Never Have I Ever, Everything Everywhere All at Once, of course, and most recently, Beef. How has this changed the way that you think about your own storytelling practice? And if so, in what way? Does Thao, do you want to start?
Sure. I felt like it gives us permission to talk about things more. Like, I am not embarrassed or shy about talking about, let's say, the food I was eating, or like Vietnamese food, or that certain festivals like Lunar New Year. Before, when I was a kid, I would keep that to myself and just say, oh yeah, we celebrate Christmas at home, or we do Easter and Thanksgiving, and the topic isn't about the stuff that we do as Vietnamese, right? So I felt like the more exposure the world gets to Asian culture and history, that it just gives you sort of like this freedom to talk about it yourself, and that, if somebody else is talking about it, then I can talk about it too, because now it's normalized. Is that the word? That's the word I'm looking for. And like I'm kind of embarrassed, because I think I'm a very bad Asian, because It wasn't until like my daughter was 7, which is just 2 years ago, or a year ago, and she asked me over dinner, and she goes, "Mama, are we Asian? Or was she Asian?" She asked if she was Asian, and I'm like, "Of course you are!" Like, well, what a weird question. And then she was like, then she started asking, like, "Is BTS Asian?" And I'm like, "Yes, BTS is Asian." And then she's like, and then she started naming people we knew, and she's like, "Are they Asian?" And for her, like, I'm not sure if it's because it's we do Asian things normally and we don't label it, that she doesn't understand that, you know, we noodles and dumplings and rice at home, and that's Asian. It's just because we don't label it. Or maybe I'm just being a bad mom and I haven't like introduced her to, like, I have no idea what. But now I'm like, I have this desperation to, like, I call up all my Asian friends and I'm like, let's do a dinner together. We do a game night together, just to introduce her to other people that are Asian, just so that she feels this is normal or this is okay, and that she can, I don't know, but like, I just felt like a terrible mom when she asked me if she was Asian. I'm like, yes, obviously I wasn't doing a good enough job. But yeah,
No,
my
I
point
don't.
being is that the more exposure Asian culture or Asian people get, the better. It just feels like this is normal. Like, there's
Mhm.
nothing special. Not that we aren't special. Please don't take it out of context. But this is normal, right?
For sure, for sure. And Tao, I'm sure you're an amazing mom. You sound like an amazing mom. And can you be a bad Asian? I don't know. That seems like a very Asian thing to say. How about you, Howie?
So let me
So
think.
the question is, like, how has it changed the way you think about your own storytelling practice? And if so, in what way?
Uh, I mean, in a kind of catty way, I guess. I've become sort of very aware of what I think good representation is, and sort of not bad representation, but sort of throwaway representation is. Insofar as how do I put it? There's this literary critic, Walter Bates, who sort of talks about art in terms of synthesis versus analysis, and where analysis is kind of just taking what you've observed and putting it down on paper, versus synthesis is where you take what you've observed in life and you sort of process it and then use it and turn it into an expression of something new, or something sort of unspoken. And I feel like every time I see somebody just like say, "Look, bubble tea," and there are these instances in contemporary film and television, I think, where we're supposed to applaud the sheer sort of appearance of any kind of cultural reference or a person, which is fine. I think like that being normalized is a good thing, but I don't think that makes it sort of artistically. It makes it politically significant, but doesn't make it artistically sort of significant, if that makes any sense. And so I'm trying to sort of identify in other people's work and within my own work, I think, if I'm going to bring up this, as I would with anything, right? Anything in any element of a story or a piece of art, is introducing this thing being used in a way that says, not necessarily even as metaphor, but expresses something that I personal or deep or sort of lyrical, that I couldn't express it in any other way.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and it just sounds like you're being really thoughtful about it, and you mentioned the thing about bubble tea. I just feel like bubble tea has become mainstream. Is it wrong for me to say that? I don't know. Maybe I live in my own bubble and I think bubble tea isn't mainstream. But I guess, yeah, and this kind of brings me to my next question about how important is it to you as a storyteller to tell stories that represent the diversity of Asian experiences in Canada? And so kind of going back to also like what you were saying, Howie, it's like, um, like when you think about like your next story that you want to tell, is it specifically about the Asian experience, or, like, are you going to show like in terms of in terms of your characters, like would you consider telling your story from an Asian perspective um, because you want to create more representation, or is it really kind of more focused on like, well, it starts with the story and then you'll kind of decide how you want to, or with which characters you'd want to use to tell that story?
I mean, it's a something that I actually still struggle with. I think because I grew up, a certain portion of my sort of art intake was very North American, and mainstream, and so I think certainly as a kid I would often force myself and feel weird about it to like create characters that were Asian. It was like a strange thing that I would make a hero Asian, even though like I watched lots of kung fu movies and stuff. So it wasn't about sort of craving representation in the art that I was taking in, because I did see lots of examples of Asian, Chinese, specifically Chinese and Japanese film and animation. So I wasn't sort of lacking in that stuff on a personal level, but I think as I work now, I'm not so concerned about seeing myself reflected on screen, like Chinese, Chinese kid growing up in Saskatchewan, yada yada. I don't need to sort of have that experience reflected, but I do think there is something about destabilizing what we think about as normal or average, that is important, and in a way it's easier for me to like talk about in terms of gender, where like for a long time the ultimate compliment to a woman would be like she can hang with the dudes, and like why is that a standard of anything, and so I think there's a sense of, there was a period where like an Asian or any sort of minority group of any kind was sort of acceptable and celebrated if they could live up to a sort of normalized North American straight whatever standard. And I think whatever we can do to sort of destabilize what we think that standard is useful.
Mm. Well, it's interesting because you said as a young person you kind of felt weird, drawing an Asian like superhero character. Would you feel weird about drawing that character today?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's just
Okay.
because it's yeah. I mean, partly Asian eyes are harder to draw for me, so that's it, it's just it would have to feel very deliberate, I think, to me.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
I'm always amazed that like Salman Rushdie's novels are so confidently and about an Indian living in India, or an Indian immigrant, or whatever, but there's no sort of, he's so fully aware of what that experience is in the rest of the world, and it doesn't feel like he's so sure about how to tell that story and tell those varieties of experiences, and to me it would feel very deliberate to have to tell, partly because I don't want to show too much of myself often.
Mm.
Maybe that's part.
Well, we're going to get to that question soon. But Thao, I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well in terms of representation, or the importance of representation in terms of the diversity of Asian experiences in Canada as a storyteller.
Well, I think when Howie was saying that, he grew up in North America, where we experience a lot of like the North American like arts and culture. I came when I was 3, so I that is basically all I knew was what was in mainstream in North America. So sometimes because it's such a hot topic now, that it both in children's books and in film, that there is personal or your own voice and personal representation. So I question, I'm like, how much what percentage do I need to be? Like, I know like in my DNA I'm like 100% Vietnamese, but like my upbringing hasn't been. And so what right do I have to let's talk about like a Vietnamese culture or experience, because I'm only experiencing it like second or third hand, right? And so for me, that's still a debate. And when I write for children's books, I start with the story. It's a good story, and then I decide how the characters should look like. And for me, what I know personally is what I see in the mirror, right? So my characters tend to I use Maddie as a model sometimes, and that by default are Asian, right? And so I remember when I got my first book review, it was very weird because they specify in the description that, brown skinned girl. Like, they didn't even talk about like the plot. They just wanted the teachers and the librarians to know that it was like a brown skinned girl in story. And then I was just so floored, and I talked to my editor and I said, why would it, what kind of like review is this? And she said, it's really important for teachers and librarians and parents to know that there is representation in this book, so that, because it is not a common thing, and that's how they choose what books to buy. And so then I started really paying attention about all the characters that I put in my stories, and making sure that everybody is represented in some way or another. And plus my background, I used to be an art buyer for educational publishing. So that was something that was really drilled in us, that we made sure, mostly in the educational market, that everybody's represented. Yeah, so it's, I start with the storyline first. I make sure that it's a good story, and then from there I decide. And I think as a storyteller, like, the best way to get an experience is a personal one, right? And use yourself as a model, whether it's like a 6-year-old Thao or a like 45-year-old Thao. But so as long as you use yourself as a model, that is the most authentic, and nobody can fault you for it, right?
No, for sure. It's we and I say we as in the 3 of us grew up in Canada with not a lot of diverse representation in our media, whether that's on TV or in the movies. And when I was younger, and Howie, maybe this was a different for you, like, it sounds like you were watching a lot of like anime and some media from overseas. I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But like, you're both parents, is it important for you as a parent, when you start showing your kids TV shows or movies, like, is it important for there to be diverse representation in the media that they consume? Is that important for you as a parent?
Yeah,
because we'll go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna say, I think yes. My stance is yes. It's important that they see everybody and it isn't just Asian culture, because I want to make sure that when she walks on the street, she's not shocked. And that she is very aware of like what society or what city she's living in. But yeah, to me, it's important.
Mm.
Yeah, I
And
mean, yeah, me too. And I was kind of, I was talking to my wife the other day, and I haven't actually seen the film, but the Disney's latest one, what was it? Strange World. Anyways, I was kind of remarking that I've only universally the reviews that I've seen for it tend to be it's a mediocre film, and they're trying to use diversity to sort of cover it up, the Miat art. And I it always struck me as like a weird review insofar as like why wouldn't you say it's a mediocre film, at least it's diverse, as opposed to like using the diversity as a criticism. So yeah, I agree. I mean, I think for me, it's for our family, it's important. We do our best, and again, we especially living in Toronto, where where we have such a diverse sort of community. The schools are sort of so many of my daughter's classmates are mixed race. That it only makes sense, I think, to sort of do that. And it's funny also, I find that looking at children's programming, even going back 5 years, 10 years, how much less diversity there is. So I think we're in a, and again, like kids don't, unless you point it out, they're not going to notice it. It just becomes the world to them, I think.
Yeah, that's great. I want to move on to the topic of vulnerability, because I feel a strong sense of vulnerability in both of your films, Howie, and I'm thinking about For North A and BAM. And of course, with such a personal story as Boat People, how important is it to be vulnerable when making a film, either in the process or showing it on the screen? Yeah, Howie, you go.
I think, I mean, I don't actually necessarily think about it in terms of vulnerability. I think, like I said, I mean, both of you have done much more sort of autobiographical films and work than I ever have. And so I think to some extent, it's being vulnerable. I think what you would call being vulnerable, I would kind of call almost an artistic vanity. It's like whatever is going to make the most meaningful moment in the film, or in whatever medium I'm working in. It's about, in a way, it's about letting the film, the story or the work sort of lead you into sort of new things. I think Anna, actually, I've talked to you about this idea of, there's this term Keats coined called negative capability, which is about, just talks about, he was referring to Shakespeare in particular, but how he lets the language lead him into new thoughts, new imagery, new sort of opinions that may, in fact, bump up against his personal sort of values, but because the strength of the art part of it is so strong that it can't help but be true in some way. And I try to sort of follow a similar thing, especially more now than I ever have, of saying, just asking myself with every step, is this moment leading to that moment? Is that, and are they being whatever is going to make it most interesting and feel surprising, I think, not in like a, you know, jazz hands kind of way, but just sort of emotionally sort of keep you tuned in.
Yeah, no. Yeah, and thank you for your insight into your process, Howie. Thao, how about yourself in terms of being vulnerable and making Boat People? I imagine that there were moments that were difficult, either to animate or to create.
I think the subject itself is a very hard subject to tackle. And when it's your own family story, that it's even more personal. Like when I am writing a book or working on this film, I try to be as honest as possible. And when you're being honest, it requires you to be vulnerable. And so, and yeah, and like it's hard because it's sort of you need to like kind of expose yourself to the world and all the faults of your family's dynamic and so I don't know, like it's also not my story, it's my parents' story, right? So for me, that is kind of why I didn't show it to them, because I don't know how they would take my interpretation of their personal experience and their emotions, because it is in some way, because I didn't get the full story. I had to sort of fill in the blanks because they're not very open into talking about the subject. So that's kind of one of my hesitation in showing them the film, is because it is exposing to everybody who watches it, like our family dynamic and their emotions, but it's also based on my interpretation. So, and like, I don't know, my family is not the most sharing group of people, so they might just not be very pleased with me in letting everybody know what's going on in our family. So yeah, but it can't be helped. It's the subject matter, right? Like the subject matter is a tough one to deal with.
For sure. Yeah, go. Yes, please, Howie.
In fact, this is to both of you. Is how do you when you're dealing with such personal work, how do you make the transition? Because at some point you have to be like artist Thao and artist Anne, and not the person whose story this is, or you know, how do you sort of make the transition into making decisions about, you have all the facts in front of you, you have to now make a story out of it, a construct out of it that is not actually literally sort of historically necessarily not untrue, but is not like you're shaping it, right? You're controlling the tension and release of it. So is there an active, like, conscious moment where you have to do that, or do you just does it just happen?
Thao, you go ahead.
I feel like for this film, we went through a lot of different versions of it, and we've tried lots of different versions of it just to hit the right notes. And it is hard. It's hard to because there's so much to say, even whether you're writing a book where it's 32 pages you have to work with, or you're doing an animated short where you have 10 minutes to say. And I totally agree with you, Howie, when you said at the beginning that making a short film, like the shorter the film, the harder it is. And so how do you say everything, and what do you choose to leave out? Was the hardest thing I've learned in this whole process. And so being at the end, you just want to make sure that it's a good story, that it's understood by everybody. And then that I also like to make things very subtle, so that the audience or the reader has to do their part, or put their interpretation or their personal experience in it, so that there's something shared between you and the audience, right? So does that kind of answer? Did I just go on a rant?
No, I think you said it very well, Tao. And you know what I want to do actually, because we don't have that much time left, is we want to invite the audience to ask one or two questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to put your question into the Q&A function, and I will see here if any of your questions come up. Sorry if this we didn't get a chance to I didn't get a chance to ask all of my questions. So if there are no questions from the audience, I'll ask one more question. And this question will be essentially more about your process. Are there any questions? Let me just check one last time. Okay, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and ask one last question to you both. Okay, so you have both worked as illustrators. Tao, you're obviously a very well-known children's book author, and Howie, you're an established illustrator and animator. Can you both describe the process of working in animation from idea to story concept, and how different animation is from working with a static image? Yeah, how different is the storytelling process from from a singular drawing to motion picture? It's a big question, but because you both have experience doing both of those things, I just thought I could throw that at you.
I'll go first.
Please.
For me, it was quite a learning experience. Like, there is a huge difference in doing a children's book and a film. I feel like film just really opens up what you can do with a story, and it plays with like almost all your senses, right? A book is basically picture and words. If somebody's reading it to you, then at least then you can hear the story and their interpretation of it. But with a film, like, there was so much that I didn't take into consideration, and I think it really changed my perspective when I sit down and watch a film. I have way more appreciation on how a film is made now, and I make sure I sit to the very end and watch all the credits, because every one of those people deserve an applause and their moment in the sun. So yeah, sound was a big learning experience for me, sound and music, because you don't think about that when you're writing a film. I mean, a book. And perspective was another thing that was a hard learning curve for me, because I tend to, even my artwork itself is pretty flat and very straight on. So those were my biggest learning curves, was perspective and sound, and like, you can do so much taking that story into a film than you can taking that story into a book.
I actually just finished a children's book.
Okay.
Congratulations.
Wow.
So
Congrats, Howie.
Was it so easy, Howie?
Yeah.
No, it was so hard, I think, and the thing that I discovered was, and I think this is a common mistake that animators often make when they think about, because every animator I know wants to do a comic book, right? And I think the thing that we forget is that animation and filmmaking in general is so about small moments, and like one moment leading to the next, and when you have to break an image, a story into a set number, like images, and a bunch of stuff happening in between the gutter between images, I think it's really hard to let go of, like, I don't have to show them tying the shoes now, and I don't have to show them like adjusting their pants necessarily, unless that's exactly the moment that you're trying to convey in that part of the story. And so the editing process of what to show, what not to show, and how much to hand over to the audience. I think the best picture books, and Tao, you're great for this, hand at least half of the story over to the audience to fill in, right? Whether it's picture books or comics or whatever. I think it's letting sort of building up a vocabulary of how this story is going to be told, and then handing more and more as the story progresses, sort of handing more and more responsibility over to the reader to sort of tell the story for you. And that was a real challenge to sort of figure out.
That's amazing, Howie. It's like, what don't you do?
I didn't say it was any good. I said it was hard.
Okay, sorry, we do have to wrap up the panel discussion because it's actually 3 minutes past 2. I just wanted to let the audience know that you can watch Howie's films on nfb.ca. Tao's film is Boat People will be hopefully at a film festival near you and eventually online on nfb.ca, but you can also find her books online. I want to thank you so much, Thao and Howie, for being here today. This was such a great conversation, and I can't wait to see your future works. So good luck to you both.
Thank you, and thank you, Thao. Thank you, NFB.
Thank you.